Okay, so we've talked about components, we've talked about auto layout, we've talked about styles. Let's talk about how we might work through putting all of that together into an actual um, web page layout for mobile, and then how that might expand to desktop. So what I'm going to do here is just try to kind of recreate um, these two layouts, starting kind of from scratch, just from all the basic items that we have in here, and just walk through kind of how I would do that. So this might be a little bit longer of a video, but hopefully it gives you kind of a starting point for how I would think through these things. Okay, so on this draft 3 page here, I basically have just every individual item. You can see none of these are in groups or anything. There's no frames. And then I just have these ship components that we already looked at how to make those. The only other thing I've done here is I've changed the background color of this page just so it's easier to see some of those light components, so that you don't have to watch through me kind of like changing, colors of stuff and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's start with a mobile frame. So I'm using the frame tool. I'm just going to select this iPhone 14 and 15 Max. It doesn't particularly matter. And let's just get started placing stuff in here. And the key here is to place things in a way that is smart so that when we adapt this frame size, things kind of adjust with it in a way that works. So the first thing I'm going to do is add auto layout to this, stacking vertically so that everything kind of stacks on top of each other as we place it in here. I'm going to go ahead and add an image in there, and again, depending on how things are set up, you just need to make sure that your items are landing inside the frame. Okay, so this is kind of looking a little odd because we have padding on the edges of this, and it's a little bit too big for that. So let's go ahead and first of all round the corners of these. I'm going to use this corner radius option. I could adjust all of them at once. For example, to make this a circle, I want the top of mine to stay square, so I'm going to use this option to adjust them individually, and just round the bottom left and bottom right corners. So I get this square top, round bottom. Okay, and then I'm going to change my width settings here. You can see that it's still looking a little odd, a little off center. I don't want it to be fixed. I actually want it to fill the space of the container, and you see immediately that kind of evened that out. And then I'm also going to put no padding on this, and I'm going to leave the padding on my items inside. Okay, that looks a little better for that. Alright, so the other thing I want is I want to make this kind of like a heading section. So, I would be working from a sketch here, and I can see that I have all of these kind of grouped in one block or unit, and you want to think of things in that way, of what things need to be grouped together. So I'm going to make this a little smaller, and we'll figure out that positioning a little bit later. But then I'm going to go ahead and make myself those heading items. So here's my text that's going to go in there. Just drag and drop that in here, and you can't see it because it is white. I'll change that to black for now, but we'll see in just a second. I actually want to group all these things together into like a header section. So I'm going to hold Shift and select all of those over here in the Layers panel. And then I'm going to add a new auto layout frame to those. I could group these, but the reason I'm using auto layout is because that automatically adds a frame, which is typically better to use than a group. And it also groups those things into an auto layout section that I can rearrange them if I would want to. So you can see as I drag this around, it automatically flips the other items to stack on top of it. So we have an auto layout frame inside of an auto layout frame. I'm going to use Command R to rename this to header. And then to get that green background, I'm actually going to change the fill color of the header overall. And I have style set up, so I'm going to use that green accent color. Oops, that's not what I wanted. We first have to add a fill, and then we can change it there. And then I'll change the text inside to be white. Okay, that's starting to look pretty good. I like that this is up to the edges here, but I don't like that the text is butting up against the edges of the frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group these things again. So I'm going to add another auto layout frame. And then I will add padding to that. So let's work in intervals of 8. So maybe we'll add left and right padding of 24 to that. And then again, this is a one column layout, so it would make sense to keep this responsive. Instead of having this set to hugging the text here, let's just set this to fill container. That way it stretches. If I zoom in here, you can see it stretches all the way across. Let's take a look at what else here. So first I'll rename this to text. And then I think this is too little space in between these items. So if we keep working in intervals of 8, let's go ahead and put 16 pixels between those. Let's look at that. It's looking a little better, but I also don't like that it's even, and I want these things to be kind of grouped together a little bit better. Because we have even spacing everywhere, it doesn't necessarily group, for example, my title of my degree with the title there. So it's really up to you personally how you want to manage this. Some people like to use spacer components, and they'll drop those in here to kind of better control the spacing and auto layout. The other option here is to continue adding auto layout frames to this. So for example, I could do that, and then instead of having 16 pixels of space here, I could make that 8 between all of these. So then if I group, that degree with the title, change that to 8, and then do the same here. Now you can see the proximity between these is a little better grouped. And in fact, I did group these together already. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I am going to add a little bit of padding to the bottom of this so it's not right up against the edge of this. So I could do that to top and bottom, but these actually, as they are currently, look pretty good. So I can control the individual padding just like we controlled the individual radius of the corners here by clicking this individual padding button. And then I will add 24 pixels to the bottom of that. So that's starting to look pretty good. All right, so the reason that we are setting these to fill, that we want this to all be a one column layout, is because we want this frame to resize responsively. So you can see as I drag this out, that background expands with it, the picture expands with it. We can fix that later, as well as the text boxes. In fact, these I should set to fill as well. If we didn't have that, so for example, if I had this, let's get back to smaller size for a second. These are on fill. These are on fill. Okay, but if we had our header set to fixed width, and then we went to expand this, you see we don't get that background expansion here. And people have all different size screens, or they might be working in different size with windows, and so we want that frame to be as responsive as possible. It also makes it easier for us when we go to expand it to the desktop layout. So I'm going to set that back to fill, then I'll scooch this whole frame back down so that it makes sense for our image for the time being. Forget what it was. We'll say it was 425 or something for now. Okay, so that looks pretty good for our header. Our image we could fix at the moment by making sure this was tall enough to kind of fit my ugly mug in there. I'm not particularly worried about that right now, but it is a good opportunity to show you maximum and minimum sizes. So no matter what size this is, the image is going to expand to fill that container, which is nice. But if this gets too small, it doesn't look particularly good. So what we could do is we could say we want this image to be at a minimum large enough to fit the top of my head in there. So you can see over here that's about 425 pixels tall. So we do have a height set over here, but we could say, because this is responsive, we could add a minimum height. And I could say at a minimum, this needs to be 425 pixels tall. And that way I wouldn't be able to shrink this anymore. And then we could set this to, well, let's not get there yet actually. So we could fill this vertically, could fill this vertically, and so then you can see that our header, even if we resize that, these should expand to fill that as well. So you can see there. And the reason that they are staying at the top there is because of our auto layout alignment options. So I could, for example, actually that's not auto layout, but this is, I could set this to a left align to the middle. And so if I expand this, oops, that's not the heading, expand the heading, you'll see that the text always stays in the middle. But that doesn't particularly matter for us right now. Okay, so let's call that on the header, which is nice. So the next section we want is kind of this like body section with interests in the bio. So just like we had a section for the header, we want to make a section for the body with all of this stuff in it. But we also want to control how that stuff is laid out. So we could arrange that stuff out here first and then drop it in, or we could do it inside the frame kind of as we go. So we'll do it that way. So I'm going to drop this in here, and because there's auto layout on this, you can see it automatically arranges, and if I were to drag this up, it could rearrange with the items in there, but we don't want to do that right now. So where did that go? Oh, maybe it didn't go in there. Okay, so we want this down at the bottom, and it seems to keep wanting to fall outside of the frame there. Nope, that's inside. Okay, so I'm going to start this section just like we did up here for the header, because you can see it's running right up against the edge of this. So I'm going to start a new auto layout frame for that. And I think I need to have multiple items to do that. So let's see. Oh, what happened to our header here? Here it is. Okay, so let's add these items in there. So we have the chips, we have my interests. So I'm going to group all these things together into auto layout. So you can see all those are grouped now. And then if I were to set the height of the parent frame to hug, it would expand to fit everything in there. But I don't want these to stack on top of each other. Actually, first, before we get there, let's finish what we started. Let's rename this to body. Let's add that padding on the left and right in here that we added up here so that these things are nicely aligned. So add left and right padding of 24. And then we also want this to fill that container the same way we set everything up here to fill the container. So right now it's hug. If we set it to fill, you'll see that expands outwards. But if you look at our example, we also have those interest chips set up so that they're all kind of grouped together and then they bump down to the next line when they get too large for the container. We already took a look at how to do that in auto layout for arrangement or composition, but just to go over that again, what we're going to do is create a new auto layout section just for those chips, and we're going to set that to wrap, because right now the body is set to all stack vertically on top of each other. But these chips, we don't want to do that. We want those to, so we could say horizontal, and then they would get too big for the frame. But if we set them to wrap, and then we set this to fill container, you'll see that this auto layout frame fills the width of the container, minus the 24 pixels of padding on the left and right. And then because they're wrapping, once this chip hits the end, because it's too large, it bumps down to the next line. These are set to, so you control the vertical and horizontal padding here. To stay in those intervals of 8, what I could do is set the horizontal gap between things, to 8. And we could set the vertical gap to 16 if we wanted to make a difference between or differentiate between the rows. But for chips, it doesn't particularly matter because these are all the same type of content, so it doesn't really matter if somebody reads them top to bottom, left to right. So I'm going to leave these at 8. That's starting to look pretty good. To keep our space at the bottom of the container here, we could add that, what did we have up here? 24 pixels at the bottom. I'm actually going to add that at the top and bottom here. And then we do have some space in between here. You can see if I hover over this, I have that pink gap, between these two items on the parent frame. We don't really need that because we're adding the padding on the individual frames in it. So I could click and drag this down to 0. I could also change that on the parent frame by changing it over here in the properties panel. Okay, so there's our interest chips. What's next? What do we have over here? We have the chips, and then we have some favorite media items. You see how I had this set up over here. Oh, I'm missing this text. Let's see. Could just copy paste that over. But I bet it's hiding in some strange, it's hidden. There we go. Okay, so this is an H2 under our interests, but it is also grouped with the media favorites. So I'm going to go ahead and throw all these over here. We have some interesting hidden items here going on. I guess we'll get to those when we get to them. Oh, yeah, but we should also rename this frame so that it makes sense that it's not called frame 4. Let's call it interest chips. And then, Oh, it's the bounding box for this icon came ungrouped. Um, and you know what? While I'm here, let's go ahead and delete these icons out, and I can show you again where you can find things like that, and we'll add those back in. So the three media favorites I have my favorite book, my favorite band, and then my favorite movie. You could make your own icons, but there are plenty of icon systems out there to use. I like using Material Symbols, which is Google's icon system, and we can actually get that from the resource icon up here in our toolbar under plugins. There are all kinds of plugins that the community makes for Figma. You'll find a few that work particularly well for you that you use all the time, and then you'll just know to search for them. You can see that I have worked with Material Symbols before, so it's in my recents. But if you were to search for something like icons, you would get all types of plugins for adding icons to Figma. But for our case, because I'm familiar with Material Symbols, I'm going to run that. So it's basically a sub-application that runs inside Figma, and it opens up this panel here. So this basically gives us a search box to look for the icon we want, and then gives us some options for what that should look like. So if I search for an icon for a book, this is the book icon I had, book 2, and then I could set, whether that was a filled in icon, grade we don't need to talk about, and then kind of the optical size of that, and then the weight of it. All these are fine. Usually your optical size you want to match to the text that it's next to. My text is 16 pixels for the body copy, so I'm going to change this to 20, which is the closest. I'm going to set this to the outlines because I like them. And then once I click on that book, you'll see it pops in here, and I can place it wherever I want to. I'm going to go ahead and add all the icons that I need for now, and then we'll talk about how to change them. So I searched for music, so I want my little musical note. Oops, because I had my last icon selected, it replaced it with that, so I need to deselect things before I add the next one. And then lastly, let's look for movie. And I did the same thing again. So deselect it, movie, click on it. And you can see when I click on that, it's adding it outside of the frame, which is why it's kind of hovering here in space and not honoring our auto layout. So I'll click and drag that into the frame, and you'll see now it lives within that body auto layout frame. Okay, let's close that plugin. And I think it would be nice if these icons were the accent color that we're using for the rest of the layout. So I'm holding Shift to select all of these. You can do it either here on the canvas, or you can do it over here in the Layers panel. And then when you select things, it gives you all the colors that are present in that selection, so you can change them all at once. So you'll see if I select everything here, it shows me this light green that's present in the frame, as well as the black, as well as the off black for the icons. But we just want to change the color of these icons to our accent color. So I select those. I'm going over to selection colors. I could click here to change it, or I could pick from my document colors. But we have a style set up for that color, so I'm going to click on those 4 dots to get my styles, and then click on the accent color, and it changes the fill of all of those. Okay, now we want to get those things grouped together, and I'll worry about the spacing of this in a minute. But basically we want our book icon to be grouped with the book title, and then the music icon with the artist, and then the same with the movie. So following the same pattern as we've been doing, we are going to add these to their own auto layout frames, and then make sure that layout is horizontal, so it's stretching across the canvas rather than stacking vertically. So I'm just going to reorder these so they're next to the correct things. And then if I select my music note and my artist name, I click Auto Layout, it makes a best guess and it says, hey, you want to stack these vertically, right? And we can say, nope, I want these to be horizontal. And then you'll see that it starts to lay those things out horizontally across the page as I want them to be. Okay, I'm going to rename these so they make sense. So we'll put music. This is set to wrap, which I don't want. I want it horizontal. I must have clicked the wrong thing. I'm going to rename this. You can double click on these, or I'm using the shortcut Command R to rename layers to book, and then lastly to movie. And then let's make sure these are filling the container. I'm going to set all of those at once by selecting them, and instead of using hug, going to fill container. And then we have some spacing stuff to fix. So just like up here, these all being very evenly spaced makes it hard to visually group them together so we know what goes with what. So it might make more sense to group these media favorites into their own section and then change the spacing between those and the chips. So there's more space between the chips in this title than there are between the title and the items within it. So I'll add those to another vertical layout frame, which it did automatically. I'm going to rename this to media favorites. And let's make sure our vertical space there to follow that pattern of using 8 is even. And in fact, we could do the same thing horizontally for these. That's not 8 because these have a bounding box, but for the sake of consistency, I'm doing that. Okay, so now if I kind of minimize everything in here, you'll see within our body frame we have vertical auto layout, and we have this interest title stacked on top of the chips, stacked on top of our media favorites. And these are currently spaced apart by 10 pixels, but let's move that to 16. Let me just double check what we used for these. Yeah, we used 16 between each section and then 8 between items within that section. Okay, so that is looking pretty good. Again, you'll see using fill on this with wrap with the chips. If I were to expand this frame, you'll see those chips nicely rearranged to fill that space. So let's go back to 425 here. And what's our last section? The bio here. So the bio looks pretty much just like our interests do. It's just another subsection, and we will make it live within our body. And in fact, I'm going to group these things together so that our interests and our body are each separate sections. So if I add auto layout to my interests, that just gives it a frame around this box of content. And then I'll drag all these in here. So these styles are already set up, as you can see. Some of these have set themselves to fill. And then I'm going to add auto layout, rename this to bio, make sure our spacing is consistent. So right now there's 16 between everything, but if we want to group our aspirations closer together with this sentence, again, we can't change them all together because it just changes everything. So we'll have to group aspirations together in a new auto layout frame, change that to 8. I'm going to rename this. And that is starting to look pretty good. This spacing is bugging me because we now have 16 pixels between the bottom of our media favorite and the top of our next section. So this is evenly spaced between these two things. So what I could do is add bottom padding to this section so that we get some additional space before the next section. So if I go to interests, I could add, we'll say 16 pixels of bottom padding, and now we get a little more space here, which makes that group a little nicer. Okay, so I'm just going through and double checking that everything is set to fill, which it is. I think that's all of our content to include. Sorry, having some Zoom troubles. Yeah, so that is looking pretty good. And you'll see when I resize this, it responds appropriately except for my photo. So we can start to think about, okay, so we have this phone layout that will adapt relatively well for different phone sizes. But if we wanted to move to a desktop layout, how would we want to handle that? In fact, this is what's going on here. Oh, because you're set to fixed. If we set you to fill, you work right. Okay, so how do we want to adapt this for a desktop layout? So, you know, in my workflow, I would have sketched my mobile layout, started to build it, and then also sketched a layout for the desktop version before I jump into Figma to build this, and decided that maybe we want to break this up into like 1/3 for the heading and then stack that horizontally with 2/3 for the body of this. There's no perfect way to do this, but we've set ourselves up pretty well to adapt this relatively quickly. Some people like to use constraints for changing screen sizes. Some people use auto layout for it. So let's start by making a copy of this. And I will rename this frame to desktop. And then we'll just start to change the sizes of the frame and adapting the settings on the content to fill that frame the way we want it to. Okay, so desktop, let's go ahead and set that up for, I don't know, let's say 1400 pixels wide. And you can see already we have some issues. First of all, my image has gotten way too big, and then this is rather ugly, all stretched out. So what we really want to happen is for the header to sit on the left of the body. The first thing we can do is switch that to, oops, not there, on the parent frame. Instead of vertical, switch to horizontal. And you can see already we're looking a lot better. And because we've already built these things into sections, we can basically say, hey, just change the way that you're arranging these boxes. Now, if these were not all separated into their own subsections, like if I ungroup these, you can see we start to get a lot more issues because it's stacking literally everything horizontally across. And so keeping things in these little groups of content is actually super helpful. Okay, so the split 50-50 is not particularly appealing because we have so much empty space over here, and it's this very symmetrical kind of half and half layout. If we wanted to do like a 1/3, 2/3 thing, what we could do is set a maximum width on our header. Just like we set that minimum width on the height of the image, we could set a maximum width on the width of the header here. So right now it's set to fill, which is what we want it to do so that this background fills all the way across. Um, but I also want the width to, at a maximum, be, something like, I don't know, 800 pixels wide. Oop, nope, that's still too large. Let's try 400 maybe. Okay, that's starting to look a little better, and you can drag this and adjust this. So you'll see this is expanding to whatever that maximum that we set is. 500 actually looks pretty good. And then I also think these are a little too wide. This text is very stretched out over here. So because we've added our padding to the body as a whole, what I could do is adjust the padding in here, or I could adjust it on the parent frame. I'm going to adjust it on the parent frame because to me in my brain that makes a little more sense, and that I want more space between these two parent items, than instead of just adding space into the child item here. So that is space between, and I can adjust that by dragging in here. That's the pink lines, or I could do it over here. So if we said, for example, 80 pixels in between, that starts to shrink that down in a reasonable way. Let's see, what else? Let's see how this resizes vertically. So we're missing the bottom here, and the reason that's happening is because our header is set to fixed. If I set that to fill, you'll see that expands all the way down, which is pretty good. Let's keep this text stacked at the top on our desktop layout, because as this gets, more vertical, this gets a little far away. And then we'll also set a maximum height on that image so it doesn't get too large. So let's grab our text items, and instead of center aligning them on the desktop layout, let's align them to the top left. So that moves them up the page. So when we resize, those will stay right below the image. And then the image, I really don't want it to get any larger than it is here. So let's see. It's set to fill right now, but let's set we have a minimum height of 460. Let's add a maximum height. And I can use just visually the click and drag to see where I want that to land. Really something like 450 seems fine. So if this page were to expand, it wouldn't get any larger than that. And in fact, it seems like it's not honoring that minimum height as well. Let's see why. Oh, because the minimum height got set to 1. I think we had it at 425. So that must have changed when we were clicking and dragging. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So now our page is relatively responsive, both horizontally and vertically. So we could leave this as two separate layouts. The one other thing we could do, and you don't have to do this, but if you wanted to prototype, and remember this is a prototype, so it's just meant to do as much as you need it to for whatever the situation is. In our case, this would be communicating with the developer to prototype how these breakpoints should respond. We could even add auto layout, switch this to wrap on the desktop version, and you'll see how that will make this so that when this is skinny, these stack on top of each other, and when it's wide, they stack next to each other. So we've set a maximum height or a maximum width on this section. If I set the parent frame right now to wrap, you'll see this doesn't quite work. But I think we can get it to, because this doesn't have a minimum width on it. If we had a minimum width on this, and then we might have to add some things to the interest section as well, I think we could get that to work. So let's add a minimum width of 425 to this. I think that was the width of our mobile frame. And now if we try to resize this, it won't go any narrower than that, and you'll see that our right side disappears at that spot, and that's because you'll see it's stacking vertically underneath here. So as this expands, these two sections then wrap to sit next to or beneath each other. Now we can't just use this frame because there's no way to control the way this padding works, because we have actually we might be able to by setting that vertical padding to, I don't remember what it was, 16 or 24. Yeah, so actually that works pretty well. But it's helpful to have these two frames set up next to each other so that we can see both the desktop layout and, oh, I see, if it's wrap, this cannot be set to fill vertically, which is another reason why we need to have both layouts. So I'm going to set this back to horizontal for our case, and then set this to fill container. And then we have our two layouts. The last thing to do here would be to set these up so that they prototype, or that we can view the prototype appropriately. And that is done in prototypes. We want to set a flow starting point. And we'll want to set two of those. So the first one, I could rename this mobile view, and I'll show you what this is. It's just a preview where the preview starts. And you can set different prototype viewing options per flow. And then I could add another flow start point to desktop. And then on this one, I could say show prototype settings. Yes, previewing in an iPhone is fine. And then over here, we don't want this one previewing in a phone because this is a desktop. So let's switch this device to something like a laptop. And then you'll see if I preview this by clicking play, or I could open it in a smaller window using preview. This just takes a second to load up. You can leave this open once you get it running once though, make changes, and then come back here to view them. Okay, why did you also switch? Let's see. What is happening to you? Prototype settings. Oh, maybe this is set on the document as a whole. Let's see. Yeah, I think our prototype settings are set per the entire document. But you would want to show them in whatever context made sense for the one that you're showing. So let's go back to this for our mobile view, and these aren't perfect, so we would want this to respond appropriately. We would want to set the size of this to be the right size for the device, which is why it's not perfectly filling that. The other thing you can do is not use a device at all, not use a device at all for this, and it will just preview the frame size, I believe. So yeah, that's one way to view that. And then if I shrink this frame, we will get scrolling behavior as long as this is set to scroll vertically. So you can see now I can scroll up and down here. And then I believe we would have to switch this to, if we wanted to view the desktop one in preview mode, in that size. So either fit or fill. Let's see if that works. It doesn't. Oh, because we need to function our size. So we said this was, I don't remember, 1400 by something like 800 tall would be an actual desktop size. Oh, I think I added that to the wrong one. Okay. No, that's good. Maybe it wants a refresh. Or I might need to switch the flow that I'm starting from. I think that was it. Yeah. Okay, so this last kind of prototype settings section is a little messy. That's not particularly important for this project, but that should give you what you need to start thinking about how you want to lay these out, and then how you will adapt one layout, the mobile layout, for your desktop layout.